Episode 14 in the story of the 2nd Battalion of the Essex Regiment in the Great War, the build up to the Somme offensive, the plan of attack. It's difficult now, looking back from where we are to the events of the 1st of July 1916, and not to look at them with the hindsight that we now have. In this episode, we're going to look at the plan of the attack and take it up to the hours just before the attack, and in a separate episode, we will talk about the attack. Even putting in that caveat, I think most of us, when we think of the 1st of July 1916, think of an image like this one on the screen of British soldiers getting out of their trenches and walking very, very slowly towards the enemy in a sort of Blackadder-ish way. This image is actually probably from a training centre where the photographer, the camera people went because it was just unrealistic to get this kind of footage in a real life combat setting. But the 2nd Essex are now finding themselves taking part in the Great Offensive of 1916 for the British Army, the attack on the Somme in conjunction with the French Army, and this is where the new army, the volunteers that joined up to Kitchener's call, are going to get their first real chance of experience. And to allow that, some of the older, more experienced units, the regular divisions like the 4th Division, were sort of scattered amongst these newer volunteers, perhaps to stiffen them up or to give them some experience that might help the attack go in. So we can see from this picture from the official history how large the attack was. It's very roughly an L shape. And we remember from our previous talking about the time on the Somme is that the 2nd Essex were part of the 8th Corps, they're part of the 4th Division, they're part of the 12th Brigade, and they're attacking fairly centrally in this image. Now, the 2nd Essex, the 12th Brigade, were not going to be the first ones over the top in the first hours or minutes of the attack on the 1st of July 1916. In the case of the 4th Division, that was going to happen with the 11th Brigade. And so the 2nd Essex are part of the second wave that will go through. And the plan was that there'd be 5 days of artillery bombardment in Phase 1. In the last hours, it would move into Phase 2 with a much more intensive barrage, including trench mortars and so on. This is also where mines at other parts of the battlefield were exploded. In Phase 3, which is kind of like 0 hour if you like, the 11th Brigade would attack the 1st and 2nd objectives, which were basically the German front line. And then in Phase 4, there'd be further artillery on the final objective. And Phase 5 is where the 2nd Essex come in, and they're going to attack the final objective. So for them, the day begins with them moving into this area marked on the map here called Ellis Square and Tolpin Trench and that kind of area, and this was their forming up area. This is the area that's quite familiar with them. They've been in this area. Look at other episodes and you'll get some of the details of this. But they had been pulled back a little way. They'd come in from the west to the left of this image, and they form up in Ellis Square as per the operational order. Now, I've already mentioned that the 12th Brigade were part of the second wave, and the 12th Brigade was attacking with 2 battalions up, as they say, 2 in the front line. And in this time, the 2nd Essex were going to be the right-hand battalion. So looking at this image on the screen, we can see the red box, which is basically where the 12th Brigade are attacking from A, the front line, to B, the final objective. And the yellow line running across from sort of left to right marks the boundary between the King's Own on the left and the 2nd Essex on the right. And so obviously we're going to be looking at the 2nd Essex. Now, the plan of attack I've already referenced wasn't quite like the sort of Blackadder stuff will tell us, get out of the trenches and walk slowly towards the enemy. It was a little bit more convoluted than that. There were saps that had been dug, trenches that had been dug through the soil so they could burst out close to the German lines and so on. But none of this immediately affected the 2nd Essex because of them being in that second wave. So when they formed up in Ellis Square, they were able to shake themselves out into their attack formation. And in their case, the attack formation was going to be led by the Scouts. And so the Scouts themselves were being led by Lieutenant Geoffrey Allen. Now, Geoffrey Allen was himself an ex-ranker. He had initially been in one of the London regiments and had been commissioned in July 1915. And a bit like having 2 battalions up as a brigade to attack, the battalion had 2 companies up in their attack, A Company on the left and D Company on the right. Now, A Company was being led by Captain Stevens, D Company was being led by Captain Smith Masters. And Smith Masters we've met a few times already because he came overseas with the battalion at the start of the war in August 1914. He had been wounded during the fighting near Le Cateau and so on. He was wounded again in October of 14. and had been awarded the Military Cross as well, and that's covered in a previous episode. A Company, I've already said, has been led by Captain Stevens, but the picture there is of Lieutenant Chawner. Now, Lieutenant Chawner had joined the battalion in March 1915, but had had a period in mid-1915 where he'd been out of the battalion sick. But my point is that these are two quite experienced officers that are going to be taking part in the attack. So they're going to be the main ones putting in the attack, and we'll come back to the others in a moment. But as already discussed, we can see that this is zoomed in on the area, and the blue ink marks there show the German positions. And so the 2nd Essex are going to be attacking underneath that yellow line, moving from left to right, in the hope that the first trenches that we see have already been taken for them and that they can just progress through those. And using the Western Front Association's Trench Mapper software, we're able to superimpose a map over the modern road map, and I've also put in a yellow line there. And this gives us an idea of the ambition behind the attack. Over on the left-hand side, we can see a little stubby bit sticking out of the German trenches. The British called that the quadrilateral, the Germans called it the Heidenkopf, and it was a sort of defensive position. Now, there's some debate about how strong the position was. There was probably machine guns in there. There may have been a mine placed by the Germans with the idea they could blow that if it was being overrun, as the kind of sort of to inflict casualties, to create chaos, and to create a crater that might then become a new defensive position. But if we look at that area, we can see on the modern image underneath that there's actually a cemetery there. And this is kind of helps us very much landmark where we're going to be when we talk this through and when we talk about what happens in the attack in the next episode. The other thing I'd like you to look at in this image is over on the right hand side, looking at the old trench map that's been overlaid over the modern satellite imagery, you can see pendant copse. And that's going to feature in a couple of the maps that I'll show you in a moment, because essentially the 2nd Essex objective was just to the right, just to the east of that pendant copse. Looking at more modern mapping, you can see the road that's coming through there from like middle left up to sort of top left. And using Google Maps, we can drop our little camera onto that road, and we're essentially looking towards that cemetery that I've already identified for you on the map. So on the 1st of July, the 2nd Essex would be coming in from the left of the image that we can see here. They would be moving from left to right, moving up onto the ridge, which we can just about make out in this image. And they would be passing through the cemetery. You can see dead centre of this image, and the ground between the camera point and that cemetery. Now remember, the idea was that the Germans had basically been sort of destroyed by the artillery barrage. The 11th Brigade have occupied this area, and so it should be an easy movement through here to kind of take up the attack further. And I've already mentioned, when I say further, I do mean much further. The black line here that runs through the number 32, going sort of almost like up, down, north, south of the map, that is the line that, according to the operational order, was the ultimate target of the 2nd Essex to reach. So again, we can see the distance involved there, and this is putting that line back onto like the modern mapping again. Now, with A Company and D Company in the front line taking part in most of the attack, there were other taskings as well. B Company, which was being led by Captain de la Mare, had been tasked to create a strong point, and the operational orders go into so much detail of it, laying out what the strong point should look at, the size of it, the bays that should be made up, how many men, how many guns, how many mortars and so on should be put into this position. And to give us a little bit of perspective on how far it is, looking at that mapping again, we can see now down the bottom of this Google Map image, or Google Earth image, sorry, we can see Ellis Square, which is where the battalion formed up, if you remember, and shook out into their attack formation. We can see the area of the quadrilateral, which is right by the cemetery, and that is essentially the front German line, which they should be passing through. And then the top dot is that strong point that is supposed to be created by B Company once the battalion reaches its objective. So we've talked about the scouts that should be leading the way. The idea is that if there's any wire, they can cut their way through it. They can put markers on it, little discs to allow people to come through. And their ambition is to cut 8 gaps in the wire to allow the 8 rifle platoons of the 2 front companies to come through. And they're under the command of Lieutenant Geoffrey Allen, that we've already talked about. We've already talked about A and D Company being the main assault companies. And we've just now referenced the fact that B Company under Captain de la Mare are responsible for building a strong point on the captured position or near the captured position. The image to the left of B Company there, that isn't de la Mare, this is Lieutenant Middleditch. He had come overseas in October 1915 and was second in command of B Company. C Company, the sort of final one that's coming into the attack, their role was basically to try and exploit forward from the final objective and to clear the space in front of the objective of any guns as it's listed in the operational order. And with the distances involved, the expectation was probably that they would be German artillery guns. Now, C Company was being led by Captain Patton, but the picture that you have there is of Lieutenant Waterhouse. Now, he was previously served as a private in the Royal Fusiliers, had been commissioned in 1915, and if you're into poetry, he was a poet, and we will return to that when the opportunity presents. The battalion on the day was being commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sir George Sterling, DSO, and we've talked about him in previous episodes. And as was common at this point, the plan was not to send the whole battalion into the attack. The operational orders say that it can be no more than 24 officers go into the attack, and that about 10% of the men should be left as a reserve, or what was then later to become called left out of battle, and that's the phrase that I've used on this slide. And the soldiers being left out of battle are under the command of Captain Maitland. This includes officers such as Lieutenant Sacres, Lieutenant Walden, Lieutenant Paxman, Lieutenant Brown, Lieutenant Avery, Lieutenant White, Lieutenant Ide, Lieutenant Perkins. Other people that I haven't mentioned is there's Lieutenant Ward, who's in charge of the bombers, and they have got a separate task to be ready to clear out any trenches that may still contain Germans, or bunkers that may, not bunkers, sorry, dugouts that still may contain Germans. One of the things that's talked about when people talk about the British attack on the 1st of July is that they walked slowly towards the enemy, and one argument is that they were carrying so much kit and equipment they couldn't move. Now clearly I'm not carrying any kit and equipment now, but what we have got from the operation order is what they were carrying. So each soldier was to have their rifle. They was to be carrying 170 rounds of small arms ammunition for said rifle. Everybody was to carry 2 Mills bombs unless they were a Lewis gunner or a scout. Every soldier was to have an iron ration, so like an emergency ration, but also to have 1 day's rations or whatever's left of that day's rations, that unexpended part. They were to be carrying a waterproof sheet, a cardigan, 2 sandbags to help with making defensive positions, 2 smoke helmets, which I believe is actually referring to the sort of gas masks of the time. They should have their washing equipment, and every soldier that wasn't a Lewis gunner, a bomber or a scout was to be carrying a pick or a shovel to help with the donkey work of turning the captured positions into a defensible position. So we now have an idea of what the plan of the attack was. A and D Company up the front, 12th Brigade being the second wave, B Company to come up as a reserve and form a strong point on the position, C Company also as a reserve to try and push through and exploit and clear out any German guns, and the battalion is ready and starts to move into position. And in the next episode we will talk about what actually happens on the 1st of July, and as a bit of a spoiler, in the regimental history it's referred to as a trying day, and it was one of the worst days for casualties for the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment in the whole of the Great War. If you like what we're doing with these videos, please do let us know. I've had a few comments, which has been very great, thank you, and a few questions, which is even better because it makes me think about things. So don't forget to do the obvious YouTube type stuff of like, subscribe and so on, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.